spill it all out.
All right, she will spill the beans for us in a second. Well, I'd like to invite you to come up and do your spiel.
Okay. And you can thank you can thank Geothink also for the we bought the pizzas tonight. So here's my maker credits at the moment. So there's Geothink. And that's your taxpayer dollars at work, because Geothink is a social sciences and humanities research council grant. It's a federal grant to investigate how the geospatial web maps, crowdsourcing, citizen science, and open data are transforming the way cities talk to citizens and citizens talk to cities. So, if you don't mind while I disappear behind this curtain and plug in the USB stick for a moment. And hopefully I will be able to see that. Geothink is 27 researchers, mostly across Canada, around 30 partners, probably the major cities. Yes, so it's one of those cities. Mostly cities across Canada, but also a few private sector partners. How many students, Alex?
About 50.
50. How many projects?
Oh,
60?
yeah,
80?
right around there.
Projects, including things like the governance of makerspaces in Toronto, if anybody's interested in that. Thank you. So I'm a professor at McGill University, and my research can best be described as the intersection of social theory, citizen engagement, and software architecture. And I also do a lot of GIS and JavaScript-based mapping, and I teach those sorts of things as well. And a little bit about me. Before university, I owned 2 companies, one of which was a machine shop where I built toys, and actually I know my way around a protoboard and a soldering gun. And another company was a small computing firm called Cybernetics, and I was also a community activist. So I've got my feet. I've got many feet in many worlds. If you want to ask me about any of those. And so the grant is called Geothink. And there are lots of Geothink students. Raise your hands, and people associated with Geothink, so look around you. If you'd like to learn more about Geothink and specific projects, they vary enormously. They pivot around these fields of tech and citizen engagement and legal issues and social justice issues and standards and interoperability, so techie and non-techie. So feel free to pin one of those down. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I view the intersection of civic tech and civic participation, and the things that I've learned in my own research, trying to make these 2 things play well together. And they don't always, and sometimes they do marvelously. So just to give you a sense of some of the things my own students do, here's an app that was based on top of Google Earth, called You Say City, which is place-based threaded conversations about what's going on in cities in terms of new construction. And if you don't like a particular new construction, you could upload your own 3D model and create threaded conversations about that, as well as do lots of overlays. This is another project that one of my students did, Anna, where she was looking at the potential for Crowdmap. I don't know if any of you have heard of Crowdmap or Ushahidi, which is, these are the mapping texting platforms or mapping reporting platforms that have been used widely for crisis interventions. So they were used most recently in, in Haiti, as well as in Nepal. And she was looking to see how easily Crowdmap, this mapping texting platform, could be used to get community-based organizations to talk about issues or slow violence in communities as opposed to acute violence. If anyone's interested, I could ask you about that as well. This is not something we built, but since we also look at open data, and one of the things we're interested in is the intersection between city governments and crowdsourced platforms like OpenStreetmap, which is not always an easy marriage because there are obviously questions about accuracy of the data and how this gets integrated in the standard operating procedure of a city. Here is one of a very few set of apps that have been built on top of OpenStreetmap to inform cities. And so we research why that doesn't happen. I don't know how many of you know about sites like NextDoor. I like NextDoor or applications like EveryBlock because one of the things that happens in my field, I tend to focus on the geospatial in my own work, is that you can have geospatial data without having maps. So NextDoor is the example of place-based activism, block-based activism. So how people could talk about place-based issues without always referring to a map. And also, one of the very exciting things about this, the field of all the data that we have these days is that it can be incredibly local. So we can work with hyper-local, we can work with very fine-grained data as very coarse-grained data. A lot of this data looks very benign. It helps the city out, it helps the citizens out, and it seems very apolitical sometimes. But sometimes the use of mapping and the use of data is incredibly political. This is work done by Alan McConkey. He is a PhD candidate at UBC. I'm on his committee, but he also has a job in San Francisco at Stamen Design. So if any of you have used the nice watercolor skins for OpenStreetmap or other geospatial data, his company built those skins. So he was also very interested in the ways in which the maps around the Vancouver Winter Olympics were being whitewashed in a sense. It was only showing the good things about Vancouver and also displacing tons of people as the city cleaned up various neighborhoods. So he and a group of artists looked at ways to marshal data, marshal crowdsourcing, and marshal mapping platforms to show a very different vision of place than what was the official vision of the place. So this is where Geothink operates at this intersection between the city and the citizen. The city in the sense that it's providing open data, it's providing portals, streaming services, and increasingly with smart cities, lots and lots of sensors. Citizens are providing apps sometimes and user-generated content, whether they actively / deliberatively contribute this or whether it's passively harvested from them. And the conversation space that happens in between and how citizen expectations of what a city should be offering is starting to shift and how it should be offering and whether it's okay for you to be anonymous or pseudonymous, can you participate at any time, what happens when you have people who have smartphones and have the luxury of time and the resources and they can participate, what happens to the people who cannot. So for example, you may very well have a city that embraces the idea of see, click, fix, report a pothole, but whose potholes get heavily reported versus whose do not? Perhaps it is the haves whose potholes get reported more than the have-nots, or possibly in a few instances, the have-nots potholes get reported excessively because this is the only way that people in poor areas sometimes see anybody from public works departments or engineering, is when they actually over-report, exaggerate the amount of infrastructure problems in their community. So looking at these questions of this intersection between civic tech and civic participation, this digitally enabled participation, and whether or not it's working. Is this an adequate model of a new form of civic participation, or indeed, is it a new form at all? So one of the interesting complications that makes it fun to do research, but may complicate your lives, is we often work by questioning definitions. So, we have this term participation. What does it mean? Does it mean I went to a hackathon, therefore I participated in governance? I attended a parent-teacher conference, I participated, as opposed to I spent oodles of time in a city council meeting advocating for a specific position. Did I buy a ticket to a hospital raffle? All of these things can be considered civic participation. So how do we define it? What matters? Do we prioritize it? So how do you define it, and then how do you measure it? Well, there's a lot of people here. I can count the number of people. I can count the number of brown faces. Hey, diversity, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that I have captured what I want to capture about civic participation. Likewise, we got open data, right? And probably many of you know what open data is, and it's data that is, and we're talking here about open government data, that data should be freely available. By freely available, it means you can reuse it, you can repurpose it as you wish, that it's free of restrictions, and that it should be raw as much as possible. But even the concept of open is contested. So at the International Open Data Conference and last year, and the Canadian Open Data Summit, which happened last week in New Brunswick, we had a First Nations representative who said, yes, our vision of open data is called OCAP, which stands for Ownership, Control, Access, and Possession. That definition looks nothing like that. So how do you reconcile those? And how do the First Nations people think of open data? They think of open data as government data sharing, government to government data sharing, and the ability of Indigenous people and First Nations people to control their own data sets, so no one can use them unless they give very, very explicit permission, and that if a government collects data about them, that the Indigenous people must have access and control that data, and if they have, and Indigenous people have updates to that data, the government, the dominant government, must integrate those updates into the dominant, the federal, the government data set. There's a very, very different opinion of what openness is considered to be. So, what are some of the things I find out in my own research? Just a smattering of findings. One, the technologies may advance, but the implementation issues issues are durable. So one of the things we know, we've got lots of tech coming along all the time, it's really sexy, we want to use it, and yet we find these problems of digital illiteracy, digital divides don't go away. And there's a lag effect where, you might learn how to use email and now everyone's shifted to Facebook, you learn Facebook and everyone's shifted to Slack, so, or you can or something. So you always have groups that are behind, and I work in rural Quebec occasionally, and I talk about digital divides and digital literacy. And there's a significant minority of people in rural Quebec who are illiterate. Forget about the data part, forget about the computer part, they are illiterate. So we're building these increasingly advanced technologies, and sometimes we're increasing the distance, but at minimum there is a lag for this. And one of the things we're finding with GIS versus the geospatial web is that geographic information systems they're very different learning, there are very different skills that are required to learn GIS as opposed to the geospatial web. So I'm looking at Rachel, who's taken both GIS courses and geospatial web courses, and you can ask her about the differences, and at minimum, increasingly we're building tools that require people to be system administrators as well as learn the platforms themselves. So that can be an issue. Two, and as an example of that also, don't get fooled by the GUI, the graphical user interface. One of the ideologies of these technologies is it's so simple, anybody can use it. So what's the logical extension of that? Anybody can use it, that means everybody is using it, and we know that is not the case. Moreover, we know that simple isn't always simple enough. So one of my colleagues in the grant, John Corbett, 2 minutes left, yikes. So one of my colleagues in the grant, he had to build a platform that made it easier for example, the intellectually disabled to contribute points, lines, and areas because Google Maps does not cut it. So that can be a real challenge. So one of the, following along that, is that, as I mentioned, the GIS expert and a community mapper falls and a techno-libertarian mapper arrives, we've got a whole set of new intermediaries or intermediaries arising, and it's not always easy for community activists to figure out how they interact with people who say, I need to know nothing about your community because my software is repurposable across all. So you get this disconnect that you may have. You may not have a disconnect with a community mapper that you can have when you're looking into hacking for its own sake. Not that I have anything against people who hack for their own sake, because it's tons of fun. But we call it the sandbox people versus the problem people, and you've probably seen it in hackathons where you have, it's very difficult to cross this divide. So I think I may leave it there by saying that, my final ruminations, let me just pass through all these slides, ignore all these slides. You can ask me about all these slides. The tech is really great, but it's sometimes difficult to remember the civic values associated with that tech. We live in an era in which Tim O'Reilly's viewpoint of government as platform as government 2.0 predominates, and it's very hard to reconnect the meaning of government, the fact that government has value. It's not merely a supplier of data, but it's also a medium for engagement. So I have that as one final rumination. And we don't want to get to the point where, hey, we did see, click, fix, and you reported a pothole to the sense that we don't need government anymore, and you could fix the pothole. So it's important to keep this marriage vibrant between civic tech and civic engagement. Thank you.
Time for a few questions.
I was wondering
Speak loud.
how did you modify it so that people who had cognitive disabilities were able to use it?
Well, John Corbett did, and he'll actually be in town, so you can actually talk to him. I can put you in touch with him. And one of the things he did was he had first of all, it's a lot of this technology is wrapped in a process. So you have people assisting you. Second of all, you simplify your toolbar. You create, and he thought quite a bit about what do you need to tell a story, and to focus less on the technology itself and the narrative and the ability to do that narrative. So you talk people through a process, so you chaperone them through a process of, oh, your story is really interesting, and therefore use this button to talk about place, and use a pointer, use a polygon.
Any other questions?